very much.
Thank you very much for having me. Graham, really appreciate it. And of course, thank you to the Brainstorm Strategy Group. Some of you in the audience may know me from previous presentations at Graham's event, but let me just quickly introduce myself for those who are seeing this face for the first time. And I do promise to those who have attended my talks previously that I've got a lot of new information to share, but let me just give you a quick reason for why you're listening to me speak on this topic. So my name is Jared Lindzon. I'm a freelance journalist and speaker based in Toronto. I've spent the last 8 years or so writing for the Globe and Mail in Canada and Fast Company in the United States, primarily covering the future of work. As a freelance journalist, and during that time, because I'm a freelancer and I can write for just about anybody, I've also been published in the New York Times, Rolling Stone, Fortune Magazine, The Guardian, Politico, BBC, plenty more. And this entire time, I've been working from home. So for those of you who are now joining me in this world, I would like to formally welcome you. Now, for years now, I've been talking about a gradual transition to remote work, but never could I have imagined that we would be where we are today. All the trends that I've been speaking about and writing about for years, they were always way off in the distance, and now it feels like they've just been shoved into hyperspeed. When I typically talk about these ideas, it's a future outlook, and now we're talking mostly about today and hopefully giving you an understanding of where we're headed as well. So I long believed that the transition to remote and flexible work were inevitable. But without the pandemic, it would have just been a small number of companies doing an experiment, running a study, maybe gradually moving in that direction. And then after they proved that they could do it and that it was a real competitive advantage, maybe some of their other competitors, other folks in the industry would do the same, but it was going to take a heck of a long time. And so, you know, businesses had just started dipping their toe in these waters before the pandemic, and the coronavirus has kind of shoved them all the way into the pool, as this unfortunate man has experienced. And so I've spent these last few months in quarantine trying to summarize my thoughts on the future of work and where this is all taking us. And this is what I've come up with, something that I have dubbed the Lindzon Law for the future of work, only because the alliteration with my last name works well. Anyway, this is sort of my way of describing the mathematical equation that hopefully explains everything about the future of work. And I will be going through each one of these points individually, but the big idea for me is that the future of work is technology plus human labor minus standardization. So what does that mean? Let's get into it one by one. And first, I'm going to start at the bottom with standardization, which to me refers to the rules and structures established to control labor during the Industrial Revolution. So in order to really understand what that means, we need to look at what labor and work looked like prior to the Industrial Revolution. And so in the 1800s, when manufacturing was still in its infancy, the British used what they called the domestic system, or the putting out system of production. Basically, merchants in town and big cities would send supplies to workers who were in rural homes and had the equipment to do a sort of simple manufacturing in their homes. And then those subcontractors would return a finished product to the merchant. This is actually where the term cottage industry comes from. And of course, during this time, pre-industrial times, the biggest industry in the world was agriculture. And for most people, work kind of looked like this. And so whether you were in a agricultural setting or part of early manufacturing, you're probably working from home or on your own land. Your work was probably asynchronous, which means that you can kind of do it at your own task. There's nobody that really depends on you and requires you to have certain deadlines. So the schedule was very flexible, worked around your own needs. And you know, you kind of finished one thing and sent it off to the next person in line when you were finished, whether that was growing a vegetable or doing some sort of manufacturing. And often entire households would collaborate on work. Children were expected to contribute at a pretty young age. And the nature of work really valued our most human traits. And by that, I mean that in order to really succeed in this period, you needed to have a strong work ethic, you needed to be independent, you needed to be resilient, you needed to be able to solve problems creatively, and you needed to be adaptable. And then all of a sudden, technology is introduced around the turn of the century, and everything changed. And suddenly, you just didn't need as many people working on the farm as you used to. And people panicked because they were concerned that all these new technologies were going to be displacing jobs in the world's biggest industry. Sound familiar? This is what actually ended up happening. What they didn't anticipate was the rise of manufacturing and the eventual rise of the service industry. But with the introduction of technology, work changed dramatically in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and the next era of work was defined by standardization. It was a world of work that was almost in total opposition to the way people had worked before. Industrialists like Fred Taylor and Henry Ford realized that they could churn out a lot more products faster and cheaper by standardizing every aspect of production. Work gradually moved from the home to centralized settings. People were basically turned into cogs in a big synchronized machine. And really the most valuable trait was consistency. There was no room for error. Hierarchical systems were put into place and strict oversight measures were enacted to ensure that no part of this big production labor machine broke down, because one little stop in the machine would ruin the entire production line. And humans at this time were basically turned into robots, doing menial tasks over and over again. And so as a result, the skills that you needed to succeed at this time were almost completely opposite of what you needed to succeed prior. No longer were our most human traits valued, but instead you needed to be punctual, loyal, obedient, uniform, and consistent in order to succeed at this time. And of course, we humans didn't much appreciate being treated like robots. And so during this period, there was a lot of rioting, a lot of protests, and a lot of fighting for rights that would allow us to be a little bit more human while still pretty much acting like machines in our day-to-day work. Things like regular breaks and better working conditions and days off and a limit to the number of hours that we could work. And so this period introduced a lot of the conventions that probably sound pretty familiar to most of us today. The labor movement of the 1910s and 20s basically resulted in the 5-day work week that we know. Holidays, paid leave, workplace safety requirements, child labor laws, retirement benefits, healthcare, all of these things that we consider standard parts of our world of work were really established about 100 years ago. And after this tremendous period of change in the late 1800s and early 1900s, not really much changed. Of course, there are some significant developments. The rise of the computer age, of course, pretty huge. There's a transition from industrial to service-based work, but the way in which we worked pretty much stayed the same. This factory system that we created for manufacturing was replicated in non-manufacturing settings. Workers were still required to show up to a designated workplace at a designated time, to work alongside their colleagues at a designated workstation. They had managers and bosses overseeing their work. And while they might not be on a literal assembly line, people were still largely treated like cogs in a big machine. The rules and conventions that dictated how we worked were largely established at the height of the Industrial Revolution and never really evolved dramatically to suit the deindustrialized world or the world of work that followed. In fact, according to these pictures, the only thing that really changed was that our desks got more and more cluttered over time. And then everything changed in January of 2007 when Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone, and our definition of work has been rapidly evolving ever since. And after the iPhone, there's an explosion in mobile technology, each new device challenging that traditional perception of work. Suddenly work was decoupled from a physical location and a certain time. At first, we were able to sort of answer a quick email or do a minor adjustment to a project on a remote device. But today, as I'm sure you've experienced firsthand recently, most professionals are able to do a majority of their tasks on a mobile device, which brings us to our next point in the Lindzon Law, technology. Just as mobile technology completely revolutionized how we work, there are a slew of other tools that are currently being developed or being deployed that are poised to have an equally dramatic impact on the future of work. So let's get into a few of them. And first, I want to talk about the Internet of Things, which people are often confused by the term, but basically it just means everyday devices that are not personal computing devices like phones and tablets, but still have internet connectivity and are therefore able to have much greater functionality. At first came the smartwatches and fitness trackers, and then light bulbs, appliances, infrastructure, power outlets, doorbells, thermometers, thermostats, smart TVs, cars, trucks, pretty much everything you can think of is now being enabled with internet technology, and that's just the beginning. From my phone right now, I can control the temperature of my apartment, unlock my front door, and raise and lower my blinds. And this is just the beginning of the Internet of Things. Pretty soon, everything around us is going to be connected to the internet, and it's going to be collecting data. And that brings us to the next one. All of this data is helping us be more efficient and providing new insights that would not have been imagined possible previously. Right now, big data is a $60 billion industry, and it is expected to surpass $80 billion in the next 5 years. Using big data analytics, companies can now automate many of the tasks previously required to be completed by a human. Especially those that are focused on the collection and analysis of data, which was previously a task that was left to humans. And so using all of this data, we can also train machines to identify patterns in a way that mimics human learning, which is what we call machine learning. For example, your Netflix and Spotify and Amazon search history, when run through machine learning, is able to then recommend products and services based on those patterns. The Roomba is another example where it has an onboard computer that literally learns the map of the room it is in, so that if it crashes into the leg of a table, it will know that that leg of the table is in that exact spot, and it will swivel around it in the future. And this technology is, of course, being deployed into cars and self-driving cars for the future. So what does that mean for the future of work? Well, jobs that historically depended on the manual gathering and analysis of data are kind of becoming more about advisory, presentation, customer relations, using data to help inform decisions and make recommendations, but it's becoming more about professional relationships. And I'm sure a lot of folks who are in the finance world would understand what I mean there, but it extends to plenty of others as well. The next technology that I wanted to talk about is augmented reality. And that is a big one, especially lately in the COVID-19 world. And often confused with virtual reality. It's important to recognize augmented reality is different. It's not about immersing yourself in a virtual world, but rather overlaying the real world with digital information. And so one example is this company or this app called WannaKicks, which basically, you can put your foot in the air and swipe through different shoes and see how they would look on your feet. And you can change the color of them. You can go up to a mirror and see how it would look with that exact outfit. And you can just expand that idea and consider how that is going to completely revolutionize retail, especially in an environment where we can't necessarily go into a store, or at least going into stores introduces unnecessary risk. And a lot of consumers are looking to reduce that level of risk. Another big example is Mirror, which the company was just purchased a couple of weeks ago for $500 million by Lululemon. And I think it is indicative of this augmented reality revolution that is going to come out of the COVID-19 crisis. So basically, it's a mirror, as the name implies, that overlays your actual reflection with digital information. So it can give you workout classes or count your reps or track your progress. And as we spend more time at home, and as we look for more solutions that don't require us to leave the house, I believe augmented reality is going to be even more pervasive in our daily lives. And that brings me to the next one, which is virtual reality. As I mentioned, that involves immersing the user in a user-generated environment. So complete immersion. Today, your workplace likely exists right now in a text-based application like Slack and email, or video conferencing platforms like Zoom, because you're probably not going into the office. And the next phase in the evolution is a workplace that exists entirely in a digital space that is accessed through virtual reality. It might seem far-fetched, but this technology is already being used today. This company is called vSpatial Inc. And basically, you can understand that as this expands, it's not going to really matter whether the person you're working with is sitting next to you or on the other side of the planet. As long as you're both in the same virtual world at the same time, you're able to collaborate. And in fact, there's a lot of tools, as this screenshot shows, that might be actually easier to access and manipulate in a fully immersive virtual world as compared to just being in a boardroom with a whiteboard. And so, as you can imagine, at that point, physical presence becomes completely relevant. It doesn't matter whether I'm going into the office or working from home. my work exists in a completely digital space. And when we reach that point, which is fast approaching, going to work will be forever changed. That might be going into the next room and putting on a headset. Anyway, the final one I want to talk about is artificial intelligence. And this is the big one. I'm sure all of you have had some experience with AI in some way or another, possibly without knowing it. If you use Siri or Alexa or Google Home, those are all early examples of artificial intelligence. This sort of voice-based AI is the first wave of artificial intelligence. And basically, it's a continuation in that chain that I was describing, from devices to big data to machine learning, and now artificial intelligence, which is the next stage of machine learning, where robots aren't just mimicking human learning, but actually mimicking human personality traits. So many people believe that as robots become better at being humans, there's not going to be any room for humans in the future. But experts increasingly suggest or agree that automation will require our work to become more human, and adapt and evolve our skills more readily, but not necessarily make us obsolete. We will sort of be working like cyborgs, with the artificial intelligence alongside us, helping to make us more efficient and productive in the long run. So let's go back to where this all began and continue on with the next point. For many of my American friends, by the way, who might be wondering what the U is for, that's just how the rest of the world spells it. I put it in brackets for your sake. But anyway, so when we talk about human labor, the idea of human labor is actually changing pretty quickly and pretty dramatically. There was a time in history, in pretty much the last 100 years, where we had three distinct periods of our lives. You start off in the education period, and then you spend a good 20, 25 years in that world. And then you have your working time, where you spend your time working primarily. And then you have your resting time, or retirement. But as we progress into the future of work, and as time goes on, we're seeing all three of these periods really blend together. Students are increasingly finding work in the gig and freelance economy while still in school, and getting job experience, because often they graduate and find out that an entry-level job requires experience. So they're looking to find more and more work experience during their during their student lives. There's also been a really significant focus in recent years on mental health and well-being and rest for students and workers, not just retirees, because if we work our butts off until we reach a certain age, we're probably going to burn out and become less efficient pretty quickly. And so, it's not just some feel-good idea that maybe we should take time off and recharge and relax. This is becoming actually imperative for businesses to focus on the mental health and well-being of their staff. And so, with increasingly capable tools and technologies, changing roles, changing businesses, changing industries rapidly, we need to be able to continually update our skills, which means that lifelong learning is going to be very important in the future. No longer do we just have this one phase of our lives where we learn everything we need to know to carry us through our careers. Learning time has now expanded to become lifelong. And we see that with the rise of non-traditional educational institutions, with online learning, with different ways of getting credentialed and updating your knowledge without actually going back to do a 4-year degree. And this isn't just for students and for those in the workforce, but we're also seeing retirees increasingly trying to re-enter in the education sphere and update their knowledge, because they want to feel like they're still aware of the world and what's going on around them. And at the same time, this sort of rest phase of our lives, the final phase, increasingly retirees are deciding that they would rather continue working at least in some capacity rather than exit the workforce entirely. In fact, 20% of all the freelancers in the United States are over the age of 65. And that is double the proportion that was recorded in 1985. That is why I've written previously, and I stand by this, I don't have a retirement plan, and I don't care. I hope I have some kind of safety net, but at the end of the day, if I'm able to, I want to keep working for as long as possible, because frankly, I love what I do, and I don't really plan on stopping, but I do plan on taking pretty regular rests through my career. And hopefully that prevents me from being so burnt out that I'm just dying to get to that retirement age and exit the workforce permanently. Um, and so when we talk about human labor and the future of work, we also need to balance with that conversation between hard skills and what many refer to as soft skills. Others also refer to it as human skills or social and emotional skills, but whatever you want to call them, there's a growing recognition that what makes someone successful, what makes them a valuable employee, isn't limited to what they studied in school or where they worked previously, or even how technically proficient they are in the tasks that are required of their jobs. Because the needs of employers are changing so rapidly as a result of things like technology that are changing the skills that are required. So, as I recently wrote in an article in the Globe and Mail, the pandemic has really proven the value of those skills. You know, in recent years, employers have really emphasized soft skills, things like resilience, empathy, creative problem solving, agility, because they thought that there was a potential for disruption. And the article I wrote that I'm referring to here basically explains how those efforts were completely validated by the pandemic. All of these employers that were focusing on the resilience and adaptability of their staff before the pandemic hit were so much better prepared and were hiring for the right skills to really get through this successfully. And I think that validation is going to further emphasize the importance and value of soft skills in the future. So employers no longer need to just fill a seat with a reliable drone who can do the same task over and over again consistently without complaining. Now the focus is really on maximizing each individual on the payroll, which remains the most expensive part of a company's budget for the average company. And so as a result, the most in-demand skills in the workplace are once again our most human. A lot of the same traits that were valued prior to the Industrial Revolution. Strong work ethic, being independent, being resilient, being able to solve problems creatively and independently, being able to adapt. Those traits are so important today. And again, I really think the pandemic has proven that point. And people often say, that's all well and good. It's good to have those skills, but I'm not going to get a job because I have soft skills. No one's testing for that. No one's asking me about that in a job interview. I would actually say that many of the world's biggest and most forward-looking companies are actually testing for that in real-world job interview situations. This is a list of a few of the most ridiculous oddball questions, the top 10, from a few years ago. This was compiled by Glassdoor, and they came out with a top 10 most ridiculous oddball interview questions every year until there were so many of them that it was impossible to make a list, which happened a couple of years ago. So this list is a few years old, but I'll read you one off the top of the list here from SpaceX. They basically asked, they asked their potential hires, when a hot dog expands, in which direction does it split and why? Now you might think, why in the world would anyone care what that answer is, let alone decide whether or not to hire me based on that answer? Well, they're not looking for you to actually have an answer. What they're looking for is an explanation of how you would approach a seemingly impossible problem. Some of the other questions up there, for example, if I were to fill an entire 747 jet with jelly beans, how would I unload that jet without spilling a single jelly bean on the tarmac? I also spoke to a recruiter for a story a while ago who told me that when he was hiring for a job on behalf of a client, the client said, anyone who comes in the door, you ask them, how do you make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? Not because he didn't know how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, but because the job required strong communication skills, and that was a way of testing for it. And so university admissions departments, as some of you may know, are actually adopting these sort of oddball, different ways of interviewing candidates because that need for soft skills is trickling down from the workforce into the post-secondary system. And so university admissions departments, especially among professional and graduate level programs, are starting to adopt some of these new evaluation methods that will help them sort of determine the soft skills of candidates. So this might sound familiar to some of you, but tools like Casper, Kira Talent, the multiple mini interview, online interviews, like video interviews, these are all ways of trying to figure out skills that someone might not be able to describe well, or at least skills that every candidate is going to say they possess on their resume, but they're not always easy to test for. And I believe that as time goes on, we're only going to get better and better at evaluating, testing, and promoting soft skills. I also want to say that there was a time when I was growing up, for sure, when people thought in order to develop human skills, or what we would call soft skills today, you had to go volunteer building shelters in Africa or something like that in order to come home and say, you know, I got some real human skills on that experiment. And that really left soft skills to a very sort of elite, privileged few. But today, there's an increasing recognition that really, I mean, working at a fast food restaurant can be, for minimum wage, can be a great way to develop soft skills like teamwork, leadership, communication. And that's the sort of thing that people are looking for as they're hiring, more and more than the hard skills, which are, again, because of technology, increasingly becoming obsolete as time goes on. And so as a result of our increased emphasis on human skills, our relationship with work is returning to a place that might be more recognizable to our great-grandparents than our parents or our grandparents. Style of work that was common before the Industrial Revolution brought us standardization, synchronicity, rigidity, hierarchies, and ultimately a robotic way of working. And so our work has once again become decentralized, especially now during the pandemic. I'm sure many of you haven't seen your colleagues in a long time. I'm not saying that remote work is for everyone, by the way. I know there's a lot of people who are struggling, and I do not mean to discount their concerns. And I will reassure you that there will be a day where you will have a designated place to go work again. This isn't the end of offices, as many have said, but I believe it's the end of the idea of the office being the standard and for many only option. I think that is a thing of the past. And I think increasingly employees will expect to be able to do work in a way that suits them personally. And for me, I've known that I work from home better than I work in an office for a really long time. And if I wasn't a freelancer, if I wasn't working remotely, I would really be struggling and I wouldn't be doing my best work in an office environment. And that's just true about me personally, but that's really not true about everyone. So I want to assure you that it isn't for everyone. And there will be a day when you can go back to your work, to your workplace, but it's not going to be the standard expectation forever. Another big change that is happening again in hyperspeed because of the pandemic is asynchronous work. So as a result of technology, the need to be in perfect synchronicity with those around you is much less important today than it used to be during the industrial era and even during the eras that followed, where one disruption on the assembly line could halt production for the entire factory. It doesn't really happen so much anymore. In fact, people are increasingly working across time zones on different schedules, receiving assignments and deadlines that they can work on independently and then pass them on to the next worker, not unlike the domestic system from the 1800s. And as time goes on and as work becomes more flexible, I believe that people will once again have the option to work from 9 to 5, but not necessarily. That will be one of the options, but not necessarily a standard requirement. In fact, I've written about this before, but I believe that we will eventually move to a place where you have an assignment for that day or that week or that month, and it doesn't really matter how or when or where you get it done, so long as you get it done. And whether that takes you 2 hours or 10 or 100, it doesn't really matter, so long as your work is able to continue on and you are meeting the demands of your employer. And so as time goes on, as work continues to become more remote, employers are going to be hiring people outside of their geographic region because it doesn't really matter. Everyone's working remotely. Who cares if they live within commuting distance or not? And that's going to eventually expand beyond time zones, maybe even beyond country borders. And you're going to be in a situation where your colleagues might be on a totally different side of the world or working completely different hours. And that's okay. You do your part of the assignment or you ask them a question and they will get back to you when they're able to. And in the meantime, you have that independence to kind of continue working and being productive prior to receiving that response. I also believe that work is going to be increasingly flexible. And I think that's pretty much seen in across the board. Every workplace has been inching towards flexibility lately. But again, the pandemic is really pushing that forward. It's unlikely that we're going to experience a strict division of work and life again, for better or worse. I know some people probably don't like that prospect, but that is kind of the reality, where we're moving back to that working in the home style that was popular prior to the Industrial Revolution. And in study after study after study, though, the vast majority of workers, I believe 78% was a figure I saw just the other day, the number one thing that they want from their employer is greater flexibility. I don't know about that guy on the top left, but the rest of them kind of look like how I get my work done as a remote worker. And so after 100 years, these conventions, these rules, these standardizations, things like the 8-hour workday, the 5-day work week, the 9 to 5 hours, they're starting to become relics of the past. And as we continue to integrate life and work asynchronously, the rigidity of the industrial system will continue to dissolve and give way to a much more flexible future. People will increasingly be able to do work however they want, so long as the work gets done. And I think one great example of how the system that was designed at the height of the Industrial Revolution fails to uphold its values today is the org chart. And those of you who have seen my presentation before know that the longer you look at this chart, the funnier it is. So I'm going to leave it up there for as long as I can. But basically, this is another one of those systems that was adopted from the industrial factory system and has persisted for a really long time without anyone really questioning whether or not it's truly effective. But it was long believed that in order to get the most out of each individual, someone had to be breathing down their neck all the time. And someone had to be breathing down that person's neck and that person's neck and so and so until you reach the top of the ladder. Now there's a growing recognition that human potential, which again is the name of the game, is maximizing your payroll is the name of the game now. Human potential wasn't really well cultivated under that structure. So you might be asking, what is the alternative? This came out a few years ago. 2016, Deloitte put this out, and over the years, I've seen more and more companies adopt this structure. So whether you work in a company of 10,000 or a department of 1,000 or on a team of 100, it's really hard to maximize the contributions of each individual. So if we're now trying to focus on maximizing human potential, we need to build a more collaborative environment. And so as a result, companies are increasingly moving towards a more agile structure, smaller interdisciplinary teams and groups with little formal structure, maybe some informal leadership, but really it's a matter of putting the people together who have the skills and capabilities to get the job done and letting them go do it without having a sort of division by department and these massive teams where you need to have so many layers of management in order to oversee each and every individual. And so finally, when you work on an assembly line doing a mundane task, it really doesn't matter how you feel about your work, whether you're burning out or you're stressed out or you're resentful of your employer, doesn't matter. As long as the output doesn't change, nobody really cares. But in just about every other line of work, studies show that net productivity increases when your workers are well-rested, satisfied, and engaged. As a result, it pays for employers to concern themselves with the mental health and well-being of their workers. So if the previous era of work was intended to turn humans into cheap robotic labor, the next era of work is the complete opposite, because we now have robots to do a lot of those mundane robotic tasks. We're finally being valued for our human traits, in large part because the robots are going to be able to do the most boring parts of our jobs. I mean, one example for me as a journalist is transcription. That used to be the most boring thing a journalist had to do every day. You do an interview, you record it, and then you spend an hour, 2 hours just writing it out. Now I plug it into an application, transcription is there, and I get those 2 hours back. So again, people are really concerned about job displacements, but when folks talk about changing tasks and roles working alongside increasingly capable machines, that's a simple example of what they're talking about. Robots aren't going to take our jobs, they're just going to take the most boring parts of our jobs for the most part. I don't want to say that's universal, but that is overall the trend that I am seeing. And so one last time, I will put this up for everybody to see. Hopefully I've explained that the future of work, in my opinion, will be defined by a combination of emerging tools and technologies that both make us more efficient and collaborative, but also reduce the emphasis on hard skills and the need for repetitive tasks. And instead, human labor will be judged, evaluated, and ultimately valued based on a combination of traditional hard skills alongside those soft skills. We're also in the process of, as I've hopefully explained, shedding the last vestiges of the rules and structures that were created to standardize work over the last 100 years. And as a result, the future of work will more closely resemble the way people worked over 100 years ago, prior to the Industrial Revolution, than they have for the previous 100 years. And so finally, I believe that the future of work equals technology plus human labor, minor standardization. And we were gradually inching in that direction, slowly but surely. But that was before the pandemic really shoved us in the deep end. And now every workplace, institution, and individual is going to have to learn how to sink or swim. And yeah, that is my vision of the future of work. And now, with the remaining time that I have left, I would be happy to take any of your questions.
Thanks, Jared. You moved us through smoothly. And
Thank you.
We got some extra time. I know some people were saying they really look forward to getting their hands on the slides or watching the recording because there was a lot of detail in there, lots of great suggestions and ideas. And so we will be sure to make that available to them. So the first question I'm seeing here is, how do you alter or influence opinions from leadership within an organization that don't necessarily believe in work from home as an option?
Yeah, I mean, that's one that a lot of people are going to be struggling with right now. First of all, I believe that the proof is in the pudding, that there's going to be, more and more people are trying this because they're being forced to, and the results are coming in. The data is being produced right now that actually shows that there is a positive economic impact by allowing your workers to work in the way that makes them as efficient as they possibly can be. And like I said, I personally would not work my best if I was in an office environment. And now there is data to back that up. It's no longer just a feeling. And I think as more of these work from home experiments are being done right now, and as more data is collected on the efficiency of their staff, I mean, even during a pandemic, when you would expect people are very preoccupied with a million other things, studies are showing that productivity is still increasing. So it's tough to really convince the old guard that this is the way to go, but they will listen to data. They will listen to competitive advantage that all of their competitors are taking advantage of, then they might get left behind. So I hate to say it, but they might not have a choice for very long. And if you really need someone to come in and convince them, I am available. So I just want to put that out there.
Thank you very much.
No
another question here from Jessica is asking, how do you feel the virtual world plays into early talent in terms of internships, co-ops, and so on? How do you think these?
Sorry, I just want to clarify. What do you mean by the virtual world?
I think this speeding up of the change of the future of work that you're speaking about, and perhaps also the whole work from home aspect of it.
Right. So right now, in the short term, there's been a mad scramble to try and make the work from home situation viable, not just for existing staff, but for interns and people that were going to be coming on in the future. Right now, people are working out the kinks. It's not going to be a smooth process, but increasingly, programs are being designed and strategies are being put into place to make this work. And I'm not saying that I have a solution right now, but I am saying that there's so many experiments happening at the same time that best practices are going to be emerging that will enable people to have remote internships for a company based somewhere else other than where they live, because the company itself is getting better at being remote and collaborative. And by the way, I think that's incredible experience for today's students. I know a lot of students that are doing remote internship, and they are definitely concerned that they're missing out on the experience of being in office. And there's no question about that. But at the same time, they're gaining very valuable experience learning how to work remotely, because in a lot of ways, that's probably going to be how they're going to work in the future. And having experience as a remote intern might actually be really valuable if you're applying for a remote job in the future, of which there are more and more every day.
Oh, good point. There's a related question here that I'll take first, which is, how will the company culture remain strong when the new employees are hired and working virtually?
Totally. And so That's a big one that people have been struggling with as well. How do you maintain culture? Culture is very important to companies right now. And, providing that human work environment really depends on cultivating a strong workplace culture. Culture is moving from the physical world to the digital space. And I've seen companies do this successfully before. Shopify is a great example where, they have offices all over the place. They have a lot of employees that don't really know each other personally or in person, but work together on a regular basis. Like them, I believe a lot of companies are going to do regular, maybe quarterly or annual trips or gatherings where they get everyone together face to face to sort of establish that human connection. But then have a lot of the collaboration and the actual work happening online. People are also concerned about the loss of the water cooler conversation, those sort of informal conversations. And so companies are finding ways to facilitate that in a digital way. It's not perfect. And I can tell you that a lot of companies see the opportunity here and are working on developing new solutions to facilitate those interactions. But for the meantime, companies are doing things like everyone goes on Zoom or at the same time who wants to be just having lunch together. So every day at 12:30, everyone in the office has a Zoom channel that they can access just to, even if they're just having it in the corner while they're eating their lunch, to feel like they are able to have informal conversation. Companies are doing, after work drinks over Zoom, Slack channels. These technologies are very much in their infancy. And now that there's a huge opportunity, more and more companies are going to be offering new platforms, new solutions, new tools that will enable those informal interactions as time goes on. So we have some tools that will enable this. They're not perfect, but they're definitely going to be increasing because the market is absolutely there now that everyone's working remotely. So I would say keep an eye on this in the next couple of years. I don't think that'll be a difficult question to answer. I think I would have a number of new products to point to that would show how that's happening.
I can understand that. Makes sense. Brian's asked, how do you see people adopting less standardization, and how can we be change agents to help that transition?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of different layers to this. I've heard a lot of employers say that moving away from the standard 9-to-5 working hours is impossible, or that it's just not going to work. There's something about human psychology that won't allow me to work 3 hours and my coworker to work 1 hour on the same task, even if I take 3 hours to do the same task that they can do in one. But I think if people aren't necessarily face-to-face anymore, the only thing that's going to matter is that their work is getting done at the end of the day. And so forward-looking companies, and there have been books written about this, I've spoken to some authors who have talked about this, they're finding ways to create different benchmarks that their staff are required to meet on a weekly or monthly basis that isn't tied to hours. For so long, our measure of productivity was hours. You get paid by the number of hours you work. You have to be at work right at 9 and you can't leave until after 5. And it was very much constricted to the standard work, standard hours structure. Forward-looking companies are developing ways that work for them on a unique, specific for them basis where they're able to track and measure the productivity of their staff regardless of the amount of time it takes. We've agreed that you need to get this task done by the end of the week or the end of the month. Here's all the tools you need to get it done. As long as it's done, we don't have to have any further conversation about it. And so it feels like it's a really bold transition to make. Companies aren't necessarily going to be diving into that head first, but there are already a lot that are doing it that way. And I think as time goes on, we're going to gradually inch our way there, but it's not going to just happen overnight. These trends, again, we've been pushed, I think, 5 years into the future because of the pandemic, but there's still lots of room to continue moving forward. And I think the point of the presentation is that as time goes on, all of these standard practices and rules and conventions that were established during the Industrial Revolution, we're going to see them start to disappear. So don't be surprised when 9-to-5 is no longer standard, when Monday to Friday is no longer standard, because that just doesn't work for everybody universally. And so I don't think it'll be a flip of a switch, but I think it'll be a gradual progression in that direction for the foreseeable future.
There was also a question about commercial space. Do you see us having a shutdown of commercial space and no longer need for it? What do you think is going to happen in that business?
That's a tough one. And I've spoken to folks in the commercial space before, and some of them are very pessimistic. You know, my brother works for a big law firm, and they were about to double their space this year. And before they signed the contract, the pandemic hit, and now they're cutting it in half instead because people are going to be working from home. At the same time, others are very optimistic because they're saying, well, there's certain situations where people need to be working together, and they need to be working 6 feet apart, and their current office layout isn't really spaced out for 6 feet apart working. So we're going to need to double our space in order to double the distance between staff. I think in the long run, office space is going to be sort of a mixed use. I think it's going to reduce, but I think offices are still going to exist because, as I said before, working from home, studies show, works really well for about half the population. The other half want to be in the office. They want to be around people, even if it's just for a few days of the week. So I don't think offices are going to disappear completely. I just think the option is going to be granted of whether or not you need to go into the workspace. So I think office space, commercial real estate, probably going to take a bit of a hit like many other industries have. But I don't think it's going to disappear entirely because there still is a large segment of the population that wants to work that way. I will also add, if I have a moment here, I do think we're going to see more and more office space outside of major urban hubs. So if my office is in downtown Toronto, but I live in Scarborough, let's say, or in one of the suburbs, and I have 8 coworkers who work in that suburb, and we all kind of want to work in an office, but we don't want to commute all the way into the city every day, our employer might just want to set up a little satellite office in that particular suburb so that we can still get together, have the office feeling and work together, but we still get most of the benefits of working remotely. So I think offices are going to look differently. They're going to be much less concentrated in major urban hubs, but they're not going to disappear entirely.
One last one here, then we'll wrap up, and that's just, and you may have touched on this a little bit already, but what do you think the impact on the future of work will have on academic curriculum and majors at universities?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I do think that the education system is going through a little bit of a crisis right now. I'm sure those in the education world know that full well, that there's going to be a little bit of reformation required. I'm really thrilled to see that already here in Ontario, they're talking about changing the curriculum to incorporate more soft skills and more life skills, things like being able to code or do taxes or whatever. And I do think that right now it's very important for the education industry as a whole to really take a hard look. And so the demand for soft skills really started at the employer level, and employers started complaining that there weren't enough soft skills amongst graduates, and now universities are taking that seriously because they want to be able to provide work-ready students. And so, I mean, it started with employers, then it's professional schools. I can say for sure that areas like medicine and law are focused so much more on soft skills now than they ever have been. And then it sort of trickles down into the undergraduate level and on and on and on until we've kind of made this an emphasis throughout the entire curriculum. So I think it's in the process of trickling down from the top, which is the employers, and it's going to take a little while to get there, but I do think that is ultimately where it's going, and I do think it is where the education industry as a whole needs to go in order to stay relevant.
Thank you very much, Jared. That's a great wrap up on that point. And you can't see it, but in the conference chat, there's been a lot of people saying great presentation. Thank you very much. Hopefully someone will be in touch. I really appreciate you taking your time. And then unless you have any other wrap up comments, I think we're good to call it a close.
Just thank you for having me, as always.
Thanks very much.